All right, welcome again, guys, back to Code Archive, and this is the lesson 2 of Spring Boot Web MVC. In video 1, which is lesson 1, we had looked at the introduction to Spring Boot, and we had defined and I explained what is Spring Boot framework and what are the advantages of using Spring Boot, and also what are the main features of Spring Boot framework. This is the playlist which is aimed at providing you the basics of building backend applications with the Spring Boot framework, and it starts from scratch up to more advanced concept of building Spring Boot applications. So if you're interested in backend, and then this is the right channel, and this is the right playlist that you should follow from lesson 1 step by step up to the end of the lesson. If you also do not have the basic knowledge of Java, then I would advise that you go back and watch the playlist on Java fundamentals so that you can have a basic understanding, because Spring Boot is built on Java. So we will continue this Spring Boot, this playlist, and I believe that you are following the lessons in the order which is uploaded, because each video is a prerequisite of the other. So in this particular video, we want us to look at the Spring Boot architecture and get to explain the general pattern when you are building your backend application with the Spring Boot framework. What is the general pattern to follow so that you can build a very robust and a nice application. So let me share screen in the next 1 minute, and then I can see the screen is on. So let me present in form of slide, and then scroll to the lesson 2. All right, so we have lesson 2. Already we have uploaded lesson 1, which just gives you a brief introduction. Lesson 2 is about the architecture or the general pattern that you should be following when you are building your application. So this is the general Spring Boot pattern that you will be following that when you are building your application. So we have, it is arranged in form of layers. We have generally 4 layers, and then we have this other layer here, and then we have this other database layer here. So from the first layer, which is the client, this is normally the client which will request for data. For example, you have your mobile application, which will send a request. Maybe when you are logging in, you send your username and password to some server, and then that server validates you and provides you the request that you have logged in successfully. So this is the client here. This client could be anything. It could be a mobile application or a desktop application, or it could be a website or a web application. Maybe you are logging in from your desktop on a web, and this is the client here. So we are not going to be using, we are not going to be building the real client, but rather we will be using the Postman application. How will the client send the request, and how can we use that request? We can receive that request and then process and then return back the response to the client. And then from the controller to the model and database and the repository, this is all the concern of the application that we will be building. So when we are building our application, we must be able to implement the controllers. We must implement the service layer. We must implement the model, and we must also implement the database where we are going to store our data. And we also have to implement this other layer here called the repository. So we will be explaining each layer as we write the code. Briefly, let me go through each of the layers to explain what does it do. and how to implement it. Controller layer, this is the first layer which interacts with the client directly. It receives the request from the client and sends back the response. So in the controller is where we will put our endpoints. This is where we will define our application endpoints or application APIs. So our APIs will all be structured here. And when the client sends the response, they sends the request, this request first of all will hit these controller endpoints. And then this endpoint will in turn call the other layer, which is called the service layer. So the work of the controller is basically to allow us to define the endpoints. This is where we all put our endpoints here. And then in the next layer, which is the controller layer, the service layer, this is where we define all our business logic, all the functionalities, and all the logic that is required by the application. And then after that, we have the next layer, which is the model layer. The model layer is where we should be able to define and create all our data classes. All right. We are going to define all our entities here, and we are going to define all our data classes. This data class is what will be mapped by the GPA or the Spring Data Object Relational Mapping into a database tables. All right. So let us say that we are building an application which is going to update or which is going to save users into database. Maybe we want to save a user, for example. So here we will have an endpoint which will expose an endpoint like, for example, get or save all users or save a user. And then the service layer will implement the logic on how do we save the user. Maybe here we want to, before we save the user, first of all, we will define a function here to check in the database whether this user exists or not. So that if the user exists, we should not add another user to duplicate the database. If it doesn't exist, then add the user. So this is the logic which we will define in the service layer. And then in the model layer, we must define the structure of that user entity. For example, a user is going to have user ID, a username, maybe a location, phone number, email, and all this structure. So whatever we are going to define in the model is going to be the structure of that user that we want to store. And then this would be our database. It could be MySQL database, or it could be Postgre database, or any relational or non-relational database for that matter here. And then here we have the repository. The repository is an interface which extends the CRUD operation service. And this interface will help us to provide with all the CRUD operation which we will use to manipulate this entity student or the entity user. For example, if we want to create a user, then this entity is going to implement a CRUD operation which will help us to save the user. So whenever we are implementing our Spring Boot application, then we must implement a controller which has the endpoints. We must implement a service layer which has the business logic, and we must implement the model which defines all our data models and data entities. And then we must set up the database where we are going to store our database, our data. And then we must also implement the repository interface, which extends from the CRUD repository, so that we can be able to get to access the database. So here we will be able to create a repository for each of the model. And this repository, we will use the CRUD operations which are being exposed by this repository to access the database. And that is the general pattern that we will be following. Later on in this video, in the next video, we will look at Spring Boot, which is asynchronous, where we will build reactive applications or Spring Web Flux. So we will have a different pattern that we will be using. And also in the concept of Spring microservices, we have a playlist. There's also a playlist on the Spring Boot microservices, which has a different pattern than this. You can also go and watch on that if you want to build microservices. So this is the general pattern of the monolithic Spring Boot application that we will be building. After this, in the next video, we will start by explaining the sample application that we will be building, and then we will be installing all the required tools, the Postman, the IDE that we will be using, and all the other related tools. And then from there, we shall start writing our first code. Otherwise, guys, this is the end of this lesson 2. It is basically about Spring Boot architecture. And see you in the next lesson, which is lesson 3. Otherwise, thanks for watching this content. And if you find it worthy, you may consider subscribing or even sharing it with a friend who is interested. And also, we will appreciate your support in any way. If you have any question about the Spring Boot architecture or any other question related to Spring Boot, you can as well post it in the comment section, and we will be able to answer it. Also, we will be posting the link in the description of this video. You can click on that link, and then you will get more resources about the Spring Boot architecture if you want to read more about the Spring Boot architecture and all the 4 layers that we have. Otherwise, thanks for watching the video, and see you in the next slide, in the next video, which is lesson 3.